Hi everybody, I'm doing one of those videos where a phrase comes into my head and we're just going to run with it. The cult of the eternal teenager. Now it strikes me, these records have no relevance to this at all. I just because I was filling up a gap. It strikes me that we all listen to music which is very much a young person's music, usually created by young people. Usually these bands and artists don't perhaps go on to do other things or develop musically potentially. For example, bands like the Rolling Stones, they hit the scene in the 60s, and there they were, really, really young and, vibrant, energetic, urgent, captivating the teenagers and the youth of the time, like Elvis did in the 50s. These people kind of struck a need. They created something within society in a way. They gave society what it was looking for, what young people were looking for. Because post World War II, there was a change in society, rationing, and the difficulties of the war lasted into the early 50s, which is when the teenagers started to come in, consumerism started to happen, etc. There was a development in the way we lived, at a sort of a sense of you could put the past behind you to some degree, despite the Cold War and everything else. And young people didn't really have the same outlook, and so music and the culture around them, movies, etc., became powerful things, and became things to hold on to, and became things to almost need, not just to express oneself, but to feel like you're part of something. Because after the war, obviously, there's a generation of people who died, and all sorts of, these young people probably had older brothers and brothers anyway who died in the war. So it was an interesting thing that period created the teenager as we know it. But the Stones, for example, they're an example of a band who they created some their best music in the early 20s and potentially into the 70s, in their early 30s. After that, what were they? All they're doing now is the last 40 or 50 years regurgitating the same songs which they've created when they were in their 20s. And this sort of sense of the eternal youth, if you like, the teenager, the youth, the young, the thing that, the energy, the things that vibe with us and kind of keep us going all the way through our lives. It's the sense of energy and youthfulness. All the music, I say all, a lot of the music we listen to is created by young people. Now, and this is maybe young people from when we were young. All the records that we listen to in the popular culture tend to be by young people. Now, there are exceptions. People like the Rolling Stones didn't really develop their sound. Now, why is that? Why didn't they develop their sound? David Bowie developed his sound to some degree. But as he got older, yes, his sound developed and it changed, and he still had his artistic shifts, and he was, in a way, he's one artist, so he had more kind of control over what he was doing, if you like. But a lot of people, they get stuck in a certain place and they just stay with it. Now, maybe that's because the record company expects a certain. This is a Rolling Stones album; it has to sound like this. The audience expects that. When they do a live gig, the amount of bands who say, we always have to do our old stuff, and they can't let go of it, they can't escape it, it's just there all the time. Because something within the audience has that eternal kind of teenager that this resonates with me, this speaks to me, and it always did, and these are the classics, etc. And it doesn't matter how much an artist may want to develop, even, they're kind of held back. Now, I don't think the Rolling Stones would ever have been anything other than the Rolling Stones. I don't think necessarily they had within them the desire to do huge amounts of different material. Now, I'm just using the Rolling Stones as an example because they're still going. But there are hundreds of examples. But it's funny because we look at classical music, for example, and we can hold and we can venerate a classical composer. Like, we can use for names, or we can drop names like Beethoven and whatnot. And we assume, and we actually don't assume, we know that they got better as they went on. In the main, their later works are held in high esteem. And yet, a pop music artist, no. Their later works are usually derided, and they're usually derivative, and they usually, let's go back to do a cheesy covers album or do some old blues numbers or something. And then their albums become very sporadic as well. Their releases become every 10 years even, because the energy is gone, it's gone, something is missing. The true artists and composers keep going, they have that, they're not stuck in necessarily the eternal teenager thing, they're developing and moving forward. And their artistic expression is reflected in what they're releasing. But you see, the audience becomes smaller. The audience for popular music and popular culture is a lot larger. And of course, in the past, when I was talking about the 50s and 60s, it was massive, because a whole movement, a whole group of teenagers in the 50s latched onto this one kind of music, because that's all there was suddenly. And of course, it splintered off into different areas and different, even in the 60s, you had the Beatles Stones thing. And then it all kind of splintered off into different areas. And of course, there are other kinds of music that we could talk about, but these are always niche, like folk music and even blues music. It's a kind of niche thing. I mean, think about jazz, for example. Now you might say, oh well, the jazz thing doesn't kind of, we don't think about the eternal teenager or youth with jazz. But when you consider the people who collect jazz, what do they collect? The releases from the 50s and 60s and a few early 70s. You got a bit of a fusion thing. After that, if a jazz musician hits 40 years old, goodbye, his records, what? No one wants to know. It's always the young people stuff. Of course, there's the cult of those who die young. That's always an attractive thing. It's like, oh, the potential in these people. Weren't they great? Weren't they marvelous? They might have been very average, but they're deemed to be brilliant because they died young, and there's a cachet almost to it, Oh, you can disagree with this, I don't care. It's I'm just running with this. The thing is, there is this thing within us all, which is we're listening to the young. There's this, do we ever grow up? Is there something within us which just kind of holds on to this youthfulness? What is it about the idea that certain composers, for example, classical composers, that we can say develop and grow and mature and get better, and yet rock musicians can't? And in a way, we don't want to hear that. We don't want to hear their latest release because it just sounds rubbish compared to their early release. Now, some people are going to say, well, there are exceptions. People who have developed a little bit over time, maybe they've been in different bands, so they've actually got a little bit more fluidity in the way they can create and the way they do things. So that helps, because as I say, they're stuck in a way in one form of expression. Even classical composers are stuck in one form of expression, because they may do a small chamber work, they may do large orchestral pieces, etc., but they're still working within a framework of the instruments and what's available to them in their way of creating, in their world of creativity. And that's what they use, that's their tools. So it's interesting, isn't it? I personally don't feel, and I'm sure a lot of people are saying this nowadays, you look at people, I'm using Rolling Stones again, I'm using Mick Jagger as a classic example. There he is, like nearly 80 years old or whatever, prancing about the stage like he was, he's 26 or something. Because there's a sense that we don't grow up. In the past, people seem to grow up. You've got to look at the movies of the 30s and 40s, for example, and you see these movie stars, these young starlets, for example, like Myrna Loy, really, really popular, and yet she hits about 35 and suddenly she looks really dowdy, kind of looks like a frumpy old lady. And that was actually culturally true for people across the whole culture, across, I know you got to just look at pictures from the past, from the 40s and 50s. The old ladies, for example, and the men just looked old, and yet they were late 30s, We'll look at films like Brief Encounter and stuff and see these people are supposed to be, they're just so young nowadays. It's crazy, you just wouldn't see it. it just looks bizarre because we're sort of clinging on to youth in a way. But I think maybe we've realized something about ourselves. There's a sense that we don't necessarily change and we don't have to change, and we can enjoy that youthfulness and we can enjoy that expression within us, and it just stays, it just doesn't change. It's a marvelous and wonderful thing, you know. I just went with that, the cult of the eternal teenager. Are you an eternal teenager? I think we probably all are, you know. Anyway, I could probably go on, and this could get deeper, etc. But let's just touch it, or touch base there, leave it there, and just another one of those videos. I'll see you all later. Cheers.